I'm going to talk to you guys about 3 different types of cracks that you'll run into when you're building bows. These cracks don't have to be the end of your bow project. The first type of crack I'll talk about is a linear crack, and I've got one right here on this bow project I'm working on. It starts at the edge of this knot, and then you can see it just goes right up to about there. This is the least concerning type of crack you'll run into. To demonstrate why a linear crack's not usually that big of a deal, I've got these 2-seater arrow shafts. Imagine where these 2 shafts come together is the crack in your bow limb. We're going to bend these 2 shafts together, and you can see that they are actually bending very evenly. Each shaft is handling its own stress. The top is handling the tension. The bottom, or the belly, is handling the compression. This is no different than your bow project. The most important thing is that you don't have a difference in bending stress from one side of the crack to the other. When one starts bending more than the other, then any amount of connection that you had remaining is going to come off, and usually in dramatic fashion, and can result in an explosion of your bow limb. Linear cracks are not under a lot of stress. The wood on either side of the crack is still going to support itself. There are ways that you can support the crack, strengthen it, and keep it from growing larger. One of the best things you can do is just to get some super glue and fill that crack. Super glue cures extremely hard and it's going to hold that together in most cases. After putting super glue on the crack, you can also shore it up with serving thread or perhaps sinew. If you use serving thread, it's going to look something like this. And what that'll do is tie those 2 pieces together and bind them very tightly and just kind of ensure that they do bend together and that you don't get stresses that cause that crack to grow. On this particular bow that I'm working on, this crack falls right dead in the middle of the stave. It's going to be right in the middle of a stiff handle, and I'm not concerned about it at all. There's not going to be any bending stress there, and so I'm not going to do anything with it. At most, I'll put a little super glue in that crack. This is the first Osage bow I ever made, and I sawed this limb off right here. You can see this crack formed across the little nub of that limb. Tension cracks form on the back of a bow. That's where the tension is. So when you bend that bow, all the forces are trying to pull everything apart. And if you have a good solid back on your bow, it can't do that. It'll hold up to that pulling. When you have a limb sticking out of the back of the bow, your end grain is running up and down this way. You can imagine how pulling this way, your finger is stronger, just like the grain in that bow. But if you go to pull this way, you can pull them apart. That's the same thing that happened here on this limb. The scary thing is once something like this happens, you're pretty much at the mercy of how far and how bad that crack runs. I got lucky that the crack ended here on the edge of the limb. I did put super glue in there, but the bending forces of the bow were so much that it kept pulling that super glue apart. If I continue to shoot this bow, it will eventually fail at that point. The way to prevent this from happening is to leave more wood around it when you're building it. So follow that grain back out around here, and then come in and drill this out with a drill bit. Completely take that out. Here's another bow that I built. You can see that I drilled completely through that knot and took all the bad stuff out and took away its ability to split because there's nothing there to split. As long as you follow the grain, have an intact back of the bow, you'll be fine. Tension cracks can form in other ways. One of the most common ways is if you violate the grain. If you have a weak spot in your bow, the same thing's happening. The forces are pulling that apart and it can split and lift. This bow had a bad splinter lift, and I actually have a detailed video showing how I repaired it. There are different ways to repair a splinter lift on a bow. This is definitely the easiest one, and this bow has been shot hundreds of times since I repaired it. I will put the repair video at the end of this video in the end screen. Now I'm going to talk about the last and the most fatal type of crack. These cracks will always be fatal if they're left in your bow. This one I'm working on has several. Laminar cracks follow the growth ring of a bow. So this one here is following that spring wood on this growth ring. You can almost always turn the stave over and the crack will be present on the other side. And there it is, in the same growth ring, there's the crack. That crack goes all the way through that wood. The reason that laminar cracks are so deadly to your bow as opposed to like a linear crack is that instead of bending this way, your 2 pieces of wood are bending this way, and you can actually hear that wood rubbing And that's because this top piece and this bottom piece are bending at different rates. When you pull back your bow with a laminar crack, it's going to shear off any connection that there was between those two pieces of wood, and it will come apart in dramatic fashion. There is only one way to handle laminar cracks, and that is to eliminate them. And luckily on this project, I've got enough room up here to eliminate this crack. This bow's limbs are not going to be that thick. So in the process of tillering and reducing this down, I am going to remove all of this wood, and I will be above this crack. To see the way I fixed the tension crack in my hunting bow, watch this video here.